Good. I'm glad to hear it. All right. Perfect. Huh?
Watching liberal heads.
There's been some interesting headlines for quite a while here. I can definitely say that. That was interesting. Yep, that was very, very interesting.
Sounds like I've seen that one.
Don't worry, brother. It's coming.
Once you see it, you won't see anything else. Like
There's just
it's coming on.
yeah, there's just a lot of people claiming Christ speaking right now in just all different directions, and apparently the pastor who prayed for the inauguration just launched his cryptocurrency with the added hype. Yep. Real dark day for Christians, and we always, it always ends up that way. You put people like that close to power, and they just end up making fools of themselves. So, praise God for being out of the limelight and tucked away, very simply serving God and with the clear calling, right? So, all right, guys, let's open up to Daniel chapter 11. Does someone read verses 1 and 2 for us? And this is just a warning, guys, a very dense chapter, okay? A lot of history. It's really neat to see it unfolds. I would say this is very akin to chapter 8. And the fact that chapter 8 has a really cool, verifiable, historical line of prophecy. This one does too. It's just not as apparent as quickly. All right, so we're going to dive into a bunch of different stuff. Stick with me. If I lose someone at some point, raise your hand. We can discuss it, all right? Because it's better that we get the content out of this really well than just rush through it and say we finished the chapter. All right, so who wants to read verses 1 and 2? Please, Mary Grace, let's do it.
Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all the
Pretty awesome, yeah. Stir up against the kingdom of Greece there. Now, according to secular and biblical history, this fits perfectly. There'd be a 4th king here. His name would be Xerxes. We would have, and scholars point this out too, there's 3 kings, and then there's a rapid succession between 4 and 5, if you want to call them 4 and 5. In reality, we had a king wrongfully try to ascend to the throne and was quickly ousted. All right, so this 4th king that actually served as the king for more than, a couple of months is Xerxes. Is that name familiar to anyone? Have we heard that name before? Where does this name appear, Mark?
Seems like he was quite the conqueror.
Absolutely a strong, powerful, emperor of Persia. He also appears elsewhere in the Bible. He's in the book of Esther. Yes, absolutely. He's the king that she marries. So Xerxes is the king who's overseeing the Persian Empire when Israel comes under threats, right? He is ruling when Haman comes over and says that he's going to exterminate Israel, and Esther's kind of raised up to have the favor of that king. She's the replacement wife, and she ends up saving Israel by letting him know, hey, someone's actually trying to do away with all of my people. Again, interesting dynamic there when you realize Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, a people who God said, wipe them out. We don't want their culture, anything like that, to Saul. Saul didn't listen, right? And he spared King Agag, and then we have Haman identify himself as an Agagite. That was not a separate people. That was just from that family line. They had this rebel king image that they clung to, right? This king would also leave a mark on world history that we're familiar with in pop culture. I'm going to ask you guys a question. Has anyone heard of or is knowledgeable about the movie 300? This is Sparta. It's a movie about Greek warriors. And it became very popular. It was a comic strip, and then it became a movie later on, more recently. And it was just a really funny take on a historical event, right? If we've seen that movie, we understand, or if we've heard of it, it's a very comic book-ized version. There's a bunch of there's mythical creatures and stuff in this movie, but it lets us know what actually happened. We have a Persian versus Greek onslaught, right? There's a ton of Greeks on one side, and we see the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans, in reality there's more people there too, but those 300 Spartans hold off a pass, and they're able to delay the breakthrough of the Persian army that was probably about 120 to 300,000 Persians strong. They had to go through this bottleneck, and they kept repelling them until they realized, oh, there's a goat path they can go around and flank them, right? But this would lead to Greece rising up and saying, hey, we need to fight back, and kind of being a little more unified. The Greeks would eventually fall at that battle, and then the Persians would go on to inflict heavy losses, and the Persians would burn Athens. But following this victory, Persia then lost at sea, and then they were pushed out of Greece by a combined Greek effort, and this is where we'd start to see the Greek city-states kind of gravitating towards each other, right? And under Alexander, they would actually be unified, and they would become a bit more of a world power, right? So verses 1 and 2, interesting little point. We can verify fourth king, yes, was rich, was influential, did lead people against Greece. Really cool detail there. We have verses 3 and 4. Verses 3 and 4 say, then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out towards the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. We've talked about this person before. Does anybody, Trevor, do you know who we're talking about here?
I'm kind of cheating here. I have a footnote that says it's Alexander the Great.
Perfect, absolutely. Something we spoke about during the book of Daniel, right? We see this great goat come up. That's the Roman Empire that has that one horn, destroys the Persian Mede Empire, and the angel tells Daniel, hey, that's the first king of Greece. That's Alexander the Great. Here we read very little about him, and yet we do read about him, and it's very, very interesting here, because again, it points out what's going to happen with a very specific nature, right? He will rule over it. It will not be passed down to his descendants. His kingdom will not remain as powerful. Greece did not. And it will be divided up in four directions, right? And that's where we have these four empires of Greece. So we can also say that this is Alexander pretty confidently, because not only do we have that allusion back in earlier parts of the book of Daniel, but there's actually some interesting observations over history that strengthen this from a secular source. There's a historian named Josephus. He's someone that we talk about as writing about a lot of the Jewish history, and even recording some things having to do with Jesus. And it's remarkable because it's not from the Christian view. It's not, John wrote about Jesus, but, he was part of the religious leadership team. He probably was trying to get famous. This is a man who's just recording Jewish history. He's like, hey, this is what happened during the time of the Maccabees. Here's what's going on during this time. And he records the entrance of Alexander into Jerusalem. When Greece finally takes over the Holy Land much later, the high priest at that time comes out to him, pulls out the book of Daniel, and shows him the prophecy and says, God meant for this to happen. Very, very interesting. And Alexander the Great is tickled pink that these people are like, oh, no, the divine is doing this, because he fancied himself as, again, being kind of the right hand of the gods throughout history, right? As he did these things, he would go out and make these sacrifices and try to please them. So he's going, oh, look, this further strengthens what I already thought of myself. I must be glorious, right? But that being said, he goes out there. He's very pleased to meet these people in Jerusalem, and he lives in Israel in peace. He's like, double thumbs up, awesome, be on your way. I'm going to continue on my way, right? Really, really interesting for us, though, again, because we're not taking shots in the dark. It's not, this kind of seems like, in retrospect, right? We could just be looking back and going, this is what the Bible says, and then we twist it a little, and we kind of make it seem like, no, we could say, secular historian says, back then in Israel, this was the consensus. Alexander the Great's being spoken of here. We can look over the other chapters of Daniel and say, look, this is very clearly Alexander the Great being spoken here, right? Spoken about here. What's also funny is some people think that this actually, Josephus disproves that Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem in this way, and that they think it's a fabrication, because they say, how could they have handed him a copy of the book of Daniel? Because Daniel wasn't authored yet, because it's too exact in its prophecies. It's kind of the snake eating its own tail. We've talked about this before. It's funny because they say Daniel could not have been written when Daniel claims to be written, because the prophecies are too exact. And since God is dead and he's never been real and all these things, the secular mind says, well, then the book had to have been written much, much later, and that's how they get the prophecy so right on, is they're recording modern history for them as if it was being written before it took place. So they actually cite that ideology as the reason why that story can't be true. In reality, if Daniel is who he says he is, did what he said he did, and recorded history, when he says he recorded it, then it's perfectly sensible they would have the book of Daniel. It's perfectly sensible they would take it and show it to Alexander the Great. It's perfectly sensible that it would exist, right? So it's funny that the Christian goes, of course, there's no problem with this. Amazing. Bravo. And the secular mind's like, well, there can't be because there's too many issues with this because, well, if that's true, then I'm wrong. Yes, that's what we're suggesting. We think you're brilliant. We're happy God gave you a wonderful brain, but we are suggesting God knows better and that history is not fabricated. Who wants to read verse 5 for us? Please.
The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power.
Beautiful. So, we continue on through our history lesson, guys, and again, I'm warning you most of this is, okay? Following the life of Alexander the Great, we would have 4 generals take over these different parts of the empire, right? During that time, we would have 2 empires stand out among the 4. This would be the one to the south and one to the north, right? The strong southern kingdom was part of the Greek Empire and was ruled by a family. They were the Ptolemaic family, or the Ptolemies, while the northern kingdom was seized by the Seleucids, who would be in conflict with this other family for about 130 years. But for that whole time, the south kind of continued on doing what they were doing. They ruled over Egypt, and Egypt had a really good trade route. And they had really good crops, and they had good belongings. So for them, they remained very rich and capable, while the north had to kind of compete with them, right? So as we read about this, we see that same thing. There's a king in the south that's just kind of more powerful than the rest. And then we read ahead into verse 6. It says, after some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she will be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. Very exact phrasing here, guys. And this too would take place as King Ptolemy II would marry his daughter off to Antiochus II. He was the ruler of the north, right? And for a little bit, there's peace. Everything's good. We have a royal marriage. We're allies now. However, that peace would end because that daughter's name was Bernice, and she would fall into competition with another of the king's already pre-existing wives. And the wife that she was in competition with looked at her husband and said, I can't believe you did this, and I don't trust you now. And looked at the other wife and her infant son and said, competition. So she went and poisoned the king, killed him, and in the chaos went over and murdered Bernice, this rival wife, and her infant son, and those who were supposed to be protecting her, just like the Bible said would take place. And this would lead to that rival wife then putting her own son as the new ruler on the throne of the northern kingdom. This would be the Seleucids, right? And that would lead to another conflict. Bernice's brother Ptolemy III would end up coming for revenge. So again, we have this idea of this is going to bring peace, right? In verse 6, they'll become allies. Check. Daughter of the king of the south will go to the north. Check. To make that alliance. She will not retain her power. Check. Rival wife made sure of it. The power in that, the influence will not last. Check. The Ptolemies did not have any influence here. They got a worse name because now it just feels like we married our daughter off to you just for you to have her murdered. Not going to bring any warm and fuzzies. And then not only that, but she will be betrayed. Her royal escort will be killed. Check. It's all there in our history, right? That leads to verses 7 through 10. It says, one from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. Her sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. This too would take place. If we look at history, Ptolemy III would smash the Seleucid forces, humbling them and beginning another season of all-out warfare. The kingdoms are no longer friends in any way, shape, or form, and this would have a huge impact in particular on Israel. Israel was not in the heart of Egypt. Geographically, they were somewhat in the middle of all of this. So they're in the middle of this battleground going back and forth and back and forth, and they're getting absolutely crushed under the weight of the constant warfare. The first offensive ended up handing Israel into the hands of the kingdom of the north at first, only to then be taken back by the kingdom of the south as they came and pushed back against them. So again, for a moment, they're kind of in better hands historically. The north didn't really have the same kind of vindictive leadership that the south would have in Israel's time. And yet it would be a very short-lived time before the south took them back. Then we read through verses 11 through 16 where it says, "Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army but will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. For the king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. In those times many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent even among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it." This point in history, again, Israel's suffering from the back and forth of this all, and they would get so irritated that they would actually rise up to defend themselves. This is where we get some of the Maccabees, right? Israel going, we don't want to be under Greek power at all. We are not doing well for this. We are suffering terribly for it. So they would help the northern kingdom and their king Antiochus III to strike at the south, and the south kingdom's rule over Israel would end up being, again, very cruel for this period of time, as they saw this chaos leading to Israel going, we're going to find our independence from them. They welcomed the northern armies as liberators, but again, it wouldn't last. This would kind of seal a little bit of Israel's fate, all right? I don't know that the Maccabees necessarily were operating as God has asked us to do this, so much as they're looking at going, we just don't want to go through this anymore. Because when we read about the Maccabees in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, again, extra biblical books, but historical ones, we see that some people are fighting in the name of God, of Israel. Some people are simply fighting for Israel independence. Some people are fighting for Israeli independence in the names of other gods. In 2nd Maccabees is the account of some of these soldiers for Israel marching out and fighting and falling. And when their bodies are recovered, they reveal that they have small carved idols of other gods attached to their armor and their clothing. Meaning that, yes, they went out to go do the thing they were supposed to do, go fight for Israel, yet they weren't doing it in God's name or necessarily by his methods. So because of this, they would say, here's our chance, let's take it. And would it first work, but then what we see come later, there's just, again, no love between Israel and the south is going to take full advantage of that and really cost them. Verse 17 says, he will determine to come with the might of the entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. The north thought, okay, it didn't go well the first time when the southern king married off his daughter to us, but maybe we can undermine them. We already have them on their heels. We're already winning this war. Let's seal the deal. Let's put our bloodline in their spot of power. We're going to undermine their power structure, and we're just going to basically be able to envelop them politically, right? The daughter who would be married to Ptolemy IV has a very, very influential name. She's not the woman you're thinking of when I read this name, but she is a forerunner of her. The daughter who would be married was named Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra we think about, a different Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra the first. The Cleopatra we think about is coming. She's Cleopatra like the 7th, okay? This Cleopatra, though, was meant to, again, married to the king, win the king's favor, win the political war, cause these people to soften towards the north, and the north kind of politically takes over for them. Instead, she would actually not help to cement that connection for one simple reason. This Cleopatra, like her later descendant, liked to sleep around. infamously and very publicly. So this Egyptian king, right, the southern king, did not lean on her, did not trust her. This did not become something that they could use to leverage their pool of power towards the north. This kind of ended up in a little bit of a stalemate for them. Who wants to read verses 18 and 19 for us?
I can.
Please.
After this, he shall turn his face to the coastland, and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end. And with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face towards the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and not be found.
Beautiful. Instead of trying to dominate the south through Cleopatra, her father, Antiochus III, decided to go off and conquer other parts of Greece. And in particular, would push towards Asia Minor, which was controlled by Rome. He sought the assistance of a very famous war general, if you're familiar with a little bit of Roman history here, who had terrified the Romans and had defeated them repeatedly. His name was Hannibal. Anyone familiar with Hannibal? He was a Carthaginian war general. He had marched those elephants through the Alps, right, that we read about in history books. He had surprised the Romans, and he was kind of the scourge of the Roman Empire because he would pop up, he would overthrow the Romans locally, he would defeat their larger numbers with cunning tactics, things like flanking people or using some different geological advantages. And when he did, it would cause the people there who were being ruled over by the Romans to go, oh, we're just going to fall in with this guy. So he kept replenishing his army and his numbers and his resources, and it became such an issue that the Romans basically said, we won't fight him head to head. If he shows up, wall yourself in, don't do anything. But if he's here, he's not this other place that he kind of controls, and we'll attack there. And so they basically decide wherever he is, like Napoleon, we just don't fight. We just fight everywhere else since there's only one of him on the battlefields. And this ended up cutting his ability to get supplies. This ended up weakening the resolve of those allies who were under Roman rule because they went, hey, come help us. And he's like, I can't. We're sieging over here. I can't run back or they're just going to attack the siege too. So these people started going, well, we're better off with the Romans, I guess. He had huge success throughout Spain during the time. He left his brother in control there. They ended up killing two very famous Romans brothers. They were Scipio brothers. And the nephew/son of them, Scipio Africanus, ended up going over to Spain and realized, hey, this isn't really like the place that a lot of generals want to be. They don't think this is the glorious spot. But you know what? If we can defeat him in Spain, then they're lacking all of Spain's resources, which is the easiest to get back into where he is. So if we can cut this supply line off, we're going to weaken him. And so this younger Scipio was like in his mid-20s. He was not cut out for the job, but he was there like, hey, they killed my dad, they killed my uncle, we're going to get him. And the funniest part of this all was that he actually used Hannibal's own tactics against Hannibal. So he went out there, he smashes through the first little bit of defense, gets a foothold in Spain, ends up sneaking down the coastline to their major city down there, the second city of Carthage, and they thought they were fine because they had like this one land bridge and then they had lagoons around the other three sides, and they thought, we're safe, all right? Scipio went down there and they said, if you attack this place, you're going to have to siege it. Sieges take weeks, and there's two other sets of armies that are quite large that'll get there in 10 days. So if you siege them, they're just going to lock up, you're never going to get through the walls, and then you're going to have to fight too many men, you're going to die. What are you thinking? He knew that there was a low tide when one of these lagoons could be waded across. So he went, sent some men to the gate that they expected them at, started fighting over there, and then sent another force around the back. Scaled the walls over, unlocked the gates. They took the whole city. This became such a crushing wound that those other armies shrank back towards where they were from in Carthage, which is like North Africa, and just let him have Spain, which completely cut off Hannibal from the supply line and started signaling the end until they were able to go out and fight in Carthage, destroy a lot of the Carthaginian strongholds. The Congress of Carthage was like, hey, we need Hannibal back here, not fighting in Rome, which disheartened him because he was fighting in Rome for like 16 years. So when they call him back, it's basically like, hey, just abandon everything you've done, all you've dedicated your life to, just leave it. We need you home now. And they still lost, which left Hannibal kind of disenfranchised. And that leaves the Greeks to go, hey, let's hire this Hannibal guy to help us out. Since we're going to have to fight some Romans, let's take the guy who's good at fighting the Romans, right? Wonderful tactical move, terrible political move for what we know happens between them and Rome later on. So they go out, they bring in Hannibal. Let me see. And instead, though, of Antiochus gaining control over more of Greece and Hannibal gaining some revenge by defeating the Romans, they end up being defeated again by a different Scipio. This is not Scipio Africanus from Rome. This is Lucius Cornelius Scipio, which was his brother. They go out and try to fight, and the Romans put the hurt on them. So they have to go back with no plunder, but they still needed a way to pay their soldiers. So for those of us who are unfamiliar, back then, specifically like Roman Greece, you don't have like an army that's just like, hey, you get paid your check, you do your fighting, you go home, you're done. When you're part of these armies, you agree that you're going to get paid a certain amount, hopefully get land wherever you've conquered or land back home, which means that you need to win or you have nothing to pay your men. And at that point, I just kind of hope they don't come home because we have nothing for them, right? This is where you end up with like revolts because you have trained men who are all disillusioned with what happened to them and they show up like, we don't maybe like you very much, right? So he's coming home with nothing to show for it, no money to pay his soldiers, and he decides, let's just go plunder a temple in Babylon. Surely there's enough treasure there that my men will be satisfied. And then he gets killed by the locals of Babylon for trying to raid a temple. So this scripture again, he goes out to wage war, he falls, he's never seen again, right? Verse 19, but he will stumble and fall and be seen no more. Bam, 100%, goes off to war, doesn't make it home. Boom, right over the bullseye. Which leads us to Daniel chapter 11, verse 20. Who wants to read that?
His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle.
Beautiful. Guys, these names are repetitive. I'm really sorry. But we get the successor to King Antiochus. We get his son, Seleucus III, who would do what? Raise taxes on all the people that they ruled to try to bring back the splendor, help their economy, right? He would fall from power, and just as the Bible says, would not be gloriously in battle, would not be taking more land. No, he would end up murdered by a brother. He would end up being overthrown by his own. So not a big public thing, not a glorious way out, not defending the pride of the nation. He gets assassinated by a brother. And who is this brother? Well, verse 21 refers to him. Who wants to read verse 21? And I'm sorry, guys. Are we doing okay? There's a lot of history. It's really geeky. I love it, but are we doing, we're okay? I know. I watch videos about this for fun, okay? So that's why I'm like, and Scipio, and that's not in the notes. That is off the top of the head. There's another, yeah, there's like 4 Scipios that were of note here. Who wants to read verse 21?
I'll read it.
Please.
He will be succeeded by a contemptible
Mm-hmm.
person who will not be given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue.
What an interesting person. This person, a person of intrigue, is spoken of before in the book of Daniel. Not a good person, contemptible person, in fact. This sneaky king assassinated his brother and would not be like his father or his eldest brother. He was not somebody trying to rule with power or gain splendor for his kingdom, right? Out of, hey, just be a good civic king, I guess. No, he was a sly king who took control and ran through bravery, often through smooth speech. He would imprison enemies, he would kill rivals, and hail himself as a god. This person was actually a prisoner of Rome for a little bit before coming back, and he came back with some of their culture embedded, right? And he learned that it was better to go ahead and just smooth over everything you can with speech and then just stab someone in the back rather than go ahead and do it up front. There's no reason for honor in his eyes. So, many times in history, enemy ambassadors would appear to this king, and rather than him making declarations of war, rather than him trying to push them around, he would actually try to win their favor, at least to put them at ease before attacking. This brother's name was Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, or in other words, Antiochus the God. This is the man we read about earlier desecrating the temple in chapter 7. All right? Bad dude, forerunner of the Antichrist. This is someone so bad that, again, when we look at them biblically, he fits like 8 out of 10 of the criteria for the actions of the Antichrist in the Holy Land. All right? So when we read these verses moving ahead, some of what we're reading, very much just about him. And some of it, biblical scholars go, this could be about him or the Antichrist because they're both equal in their characteristic here, right? That's how close to just pure evil this man was and how he dealt with people. In verses 22 through 24, it says, then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. People think that may have been the high priest of the temple. During this man's rule, God promised that he would be blessed for a time, that what he touched would come to success, and it did. Not only that, but he had power over Israel, and he was able to actually remove murder, shock, the high priest of the temple, and made it a sold position. He appointed who he wanted to be high priest, and it was the highest bidder. So that's what they think they're talking about a priest of the covenant, or a prince of the covenant there. Verse 23 says, after coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them, and he will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. At first, again, this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, was overwhelmingly successful. He was able to keep his enemies at bay with his speech and overwhelm his enemies that he wanted to take down with his armies. Something Daniel said again would happen, and he would catch these enemies off guard after flattering them, and he would accomplish more than his predecessors. He would retake much of the land that was lost to the north, and he would push the influence and the power of his part of the kingdom well beyond where it had been before. Then we read verses 25 through 27. Let's say, with a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions, this is the king of the south, will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will come at the appointed time. Antiochus would lead a military campaign against the king of the south and would thrash them. Egypt had control over much of the south, and he would find that there was a way to wiggle into Egypt. Antiochus, understanding that he had the advantage, went over and told the rich and elite of Egypt, support me. We'll make your life better. Which meant that he was able to undermine a lot of the power that was in place, undermine the south, and push into their own domain proper. He ended up taking so much of Egypt that he couldn't actually hold it all. He had to release some of it back to the enemy forces because he didn't have enough men to keep garrisons there, to keep a firm control over it. So again, this fulfills Daniel's words that those who eat of the king's provisions will try to destroy him. They turn on him. They're turncoats in this because there's a higher bidder, there's a better opportunity for them. And then there would be a momentary peace between the kings. Again, as they sit down to make some concessions, they would lie to one another about, hey, we should never do this again. When in reality, the king of the north is going, I'm going to come back with more men, and then we're going to fully take Egypt, and we're going to wipe the kingdom of the south off the map once and for all. While the king of the south is saying things like, well, you know, you won fair and square, and he's going to go run off and call on his allies to come help and surprise the king of the north. The end of this conflict would see Antiochus Epiphanes basically institute a bit of a puppet government over much of Egypt. He would have his people in control. He would make sure that his ruling class, for all those people that turned on the king of the south, make sure that he cemented his rulers where they were supposed to be, right? And this would also lead to the absolute peak of his power and one of the cruelest times in Israel's history. The south, right, decided, hey, we can't take this fight. We're just going to leave this guy be. This guy blows on through. And then in verse 28, we read this. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth. His heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. Antiochus historically hated the Jews. Why? Does anybody know? We talked about it before just a little bit. Later on, well, let's talk about Sunday mornings. We're talking about Hebraic Jews versus what kind of Jew? Hellenized. What was a Hellenized Jew? It was someone who spoke the language of the Gentiles, in particular, Greek. Romans adopted a lot of the Greek culture, right? One of the big things the Greek Empire did was try to expand their influence by bringing their ideologies, their gods, their language, which is why even after Greece is crushed by Rome, Rome still speaks Koine Greek. Rome still has the same pantheon as Greece, just under different names, right? If you look at the gods of the Greeks versus the gods of the Romans, it's the Greek gods just with different names. You know, we have the war god Mars become, what's the name of the war god? I'm forgetting the name in Rome. He was even in the Wonder Woman movie. This is so shameful.
I'm only thinking of Hermes.
No, it's not Hercules. I'm going to remember too, and it's going to be the worst. No, Zeus is... Yes, and who's the god of war? Mars is the Greek god of war. What's the Roman? It's such a better name. Anyway, they would literally just take the same god, or maybe Mars was the Roman one and the Greek one was named differently. They would take the same god and just rename him, but they had like the same origin stories, the same domains they rolled over, all these different things. They basically just like copy, pasted. Ares, thank you. It was Ares. Ares. Ares just became Mars. It's the same god of war, all this different stuff. Greek. Thank you. The recording has it now. Sherry texted Ares. There you go, Sherry. Thank you. That delay is not as long as I thought it was. They basically took great pride in helping to push their influence across the globe by becoming the common language, the common ideology, all these different things. And Israel was historically very reluctant to do this. Why? Because they didn't want to assimilate. They're like, we're God's people. We're supposed to stand out and be different. So no, we don't want to start speaking Greek. We don't want to worship your gods. We don't want all these other things. And that frustrated Antiochus Epiphanes to no end. So he started to pressure them to get them to stop holding all these customs like worshiping God. And that's something that would lead to what we read about the abomination that causes desolation, right? So let's read here at verses 29 and 30. Yes, please go for it.
So when it keeps talking about they're against the Holy Covenant, what is it referring to? Because
those who are holding to God's law. So they're supposed to exclude other gods. That's their promise to God, our covenant with God. Keep to the Ten Commandments, all these different things that God has given them.
The Christians that are battling don't believe in our God.
They don't believe in our God at all.
So what's the significance of saying
They-
they're against the Holy Covenant?
They want them to wipe away the Jewish religion and adopt their pantheon. So they're basically telling the Jews,
Okay.
no, don't worship Jehovah, don't worship I Am, don't worship whoever. Worship Zeus, worship Ares, worship all these other
When
ones.
it says they're against it, it's not that they're turning away from it. It's
No.
that they're saying we don't believe it. You should believe what we believe.
They're trying to get them to forsake it.
My second question is, all these battles are happening around Israel.
Yeah.
Why don't they just destroy Israel?
They're trying to take property. They're not fighting Israel itself most of the time. They're just fighting around these different places. So again, they're pushing towards Egypt. Israel's just on the way. So
They don't care about that.
they don't. We'll take it. If you fortify it, we'll knock it down if we have to. Better that you leave more intact so we have property later on, right? So they're not actually gunning for Israel, but Israel's feeling the sting of having armies march back and forth and back and forth. And in particular now, they're in the hands of a really wicked king, right? Antiochus is looking at them going, okay, let's finish the job a little bit here. Because again, you guys have been resisting that call to be Greek enough.
Right.
You aren't speaking our language. You're not worshiping our pantheon. So we're going to have to change this and rip you from your culture. We're going to try to assimilate you fully. Exactly. That's what we get in here in verses 29 and 30. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different than it was before. He goes to finish the job. He goes, let's blow through Israel. No big deal. Let's go to Egypt. Let's finish taking Egypt. Once we have Egypt, we have their big capital cities and everything. We have their resources. We have their trade, right? Again, we know that Egypt was incredibly fertile. They have the Nile. They're doing great. So if we can get all of their food, all their infrastructure, well, it's just, we've taken the king. It's over. We've won the game. King of the South, after saying, yeah, no, fair is fair. You won. No big deal. They ran off to go get a buddy, an ally who had been busy for a while. So as it says in verse 29, this time the outcome will be different than what it was before. Verse 30, ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the holy covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the holy covenant. The southern kingdom ran to Rome. They were actually partners with Rome. They were supposed to be the part of the kingdom that Rome supported. They thought, good, the south is out of the way. We'll support the southern Greeks, not the northern Greeks who are on our borders, because they might push up against us. So go southern Greece. The problem for the southern Greeks was that Rome was really, really busy with the war in Macedonia. So they were trying to fight this other war for the longest time. There's repeated wars, right? They had their hands full elsewhere. Then they finished the Macedonian war, and then the southern kingdom's like, hey, you busy? Would you like to come over here and help us out? I said, absolutely. Suddenly the northern kingdom rolls in to try to assert dominance, and they're like, oh shoot, it's not just the southern Greeks who are fighting, it's the Roman Empire, who is very well equipped. They're good sailors. These are these, what does it say right here about the west? Ships from the western coastlands. If you look on a map, west you have Italy, everything like that. That's where they're coming from. They're going, let's just pause this real quick. Antiochus can't beat them. In fact, there's an historical account of Antiochus getting stood on sand. They draw a circle around him, and then the Romans tell him, one of two things is going to happen. You're going to step out of the circle, you're going to draw your sword, and we're going to kill you. Or you're going to agree to our terms, and then you're going to leave the circle and go home. And their terms were, we're going to take a lot of your land, and then you're going to pay us tribute for causing us this problem. And then you're going to leave, and you're not going to come back again. He steps out of the circle, agreeing to the terms that they gave him. And then what we read in verse 30, he turns back and vents his fury against the holy covenant, shows favor to those who abandon it. He goes back, and basically, after realizing that he's lost all of these things, he's run into this obstacle, it's not movable, he comes into Israel with a little bit of that whole, I've had a bad day, I'm going to kick the puppy energy. He goes to Israel, and he just takes it out on them. This is where we read about him stopping worship in the temple. This is where he erects a statue to Zeus in the temple of Jerusalem and sacrifices a pig to Zeus on the altar. All huge no-nos. He persecutes the people. And we'll read about that a little bit here, because all he's doing is, again, taking this frustration out about, you've always been a thorn in my side. Now we're going to get you, right? Verse 31, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. Check, 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 check. He does all that stuff historically. Verses 32 through 35, with flattery, and I love, just let's pay attention to this, okay? This is maybe the best part of the whole message for us, applicably. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenants. But the people who know their God will firmly resist him. What an interesting divide. Verse 33. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. Verse 34. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Verse 35. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. During this period, Antiochus would kill 80,000 Jews. Those are the people who would not listen. They say, we will not bow, we will not take what you're giving us. They end up killed by the sword, burned. He sold 40,000 into slavery. Or these faithful people say, we're not going to do it. He goes, great, then you're going to turn a profit for me. And he made another 40,000 into prisoners of his rule. If you're keeping count, that's 160,000 people. Israel's not that big. This would have been devastating, okay? And he allows those who are simply going to be dissuaded of the truth to continue on. Hey, this is all we ever asked for. Just worship our gods. Forget about what's going on. Interesting piece of history that I didn't realize. We taught about the Samaritans this last Sunday, about how they were despised because of what took place during the conquering of Israel by Assyria. Samaria, I didn't realize, also did something really terrible during this period of time. The Samaritans being mixed, half Jewish, half not. When Epiphany shows up, they're like, oh no, we don't know those guys. They completely distance themselves, like, oh, Those are the sons of Abraham right over there. Don't look at us. You say we got to worship Zeus on this mountain? Absolutely. We worship on the mountain. No problems here. And later on we read about the woman at the well in John chapter 4. They still worship on the mountain. They just worship God on the mountain, right? Where it's like they kind of like, oh no, we always worship God just on the mountain. They didn't really want to own up to some of their history, but it was like, we know what you did. They rolled right through. There was no problems. You weren't in slavery with us, all right? We had to hike back. There was none of you there. Samaria was like, we want no part of this. Really interesting bit of history there, right? I look at this, though. I think this is really, really interesting because Antiochus comes with force against the temple, but not necessarily with force against the people initially. He uses force when necessary, but the first thing that's spoken of here in verse 32 is he comes with flattery to corrupt those who have violated the covenant. He comes over to actually lead the people away from God. Obviously, right now as a church, we're not being attacked physically. But I believe this is exactly the attack the church is going through right now, as we see an attack on our theology, as we see attacks from speakers who sound really good, who portray themselves as Christians, who portray themselves as men of the Bible, right? And yet, what do they preach? Nothing having to do with what God has asked us to do. Everything that fits in with the culture and things around us, right? Again, we're talking about that pastor at the inauguration over here, and she spouts off all these different points about, we need to stand up for LGBT plus Q community, all these different things. That's anti-biblical. That's not just, we're not saying have mercy on. She's saying we need to champion these causes. That's someone who has a white collar around their neck, signifying that they're supposed to be servants of God, and yet what they're spouting off is directly anti-biblical, right? It's, hey, I'm a Christian, trust me. No, absolutely not, right? In our churches right now, we're being told by the culture that we are wrong, that we need to set things aside, that we need to understand church ends at the doors of government. Don't bring that, all these different things. Absolutely not. How many of us have heard you can't legislate righteousness? It sounds good. You can't force people to be Christians. True. Do you want people getting murdered? I think we legislated righteousness there. I'm pretty sure we said don't kill people. And there was a Christian foundation for that, and society wouldn't be possible without it. Okay? Good little catchphrase. Don't try to force people to, okay, great. I'm not going to try to force people to follow God, but I'm 100% going to say I'm going to force you not to murder me. I'm so sorry that inconveniences you. So, as we look at this, I think this is exactly what we're looking at. Our church is under that first wave of little, hey, just be dissuaded of the truth. Slowly and surely. Hey, don't worry about it. Your God can look however we want him to look like. Hey, this is probably your same God. He's just called Zeus by us. Same God, different name. How many of us have heard that? We're all worshiping something. Just, you see the elephant from the behind. I see it from the front. We're all worshiping the same thing. It's just verbalized different. My God said the way, the truth, the life. My God did not say a truth, a way, a life. Okay? He did not suggest there were other great teachers who could also lead you into eternity. He said no one comes to the Father except through me. So for us, no. Sorry. We have to be those people who look Antiochus in the eyes and go, great speech. I don't doubt you're going to murder me, but no. And then move on, because one day the church will face force. It's not always going to be speech. It's not always going to be silver-tongued misleading. One day it's going to be, you got to make a choice here for us, right? For Israel, that choice did come. Many did die. However, some did. They just bowed knee. And what's interesting is that last little bit, too, it calls some of the wise those who stumble, and yet they be refined and purified and made spotless until the time of the end. I wonder if that's not a reference to somebody who would end up being wise. If we look at their life and say, these were one of the wise, these were one of the people who followed God, and yet their story started with them folding to the pressure and then living a little bit and understanding, oh no, I made a huge mistake, and being turned back and going, nope, I got to stand for God, right? What an interesting thing to read about, because that would be a testimony. Just thought that was super cool. Any thoughts on this before we move ahead? We're going to get into some harder hitting stuff again. Mm-hmm.
God says, and not leaning
Mm-hmm.
to what these others, and the comparison be like we see a picture of the Leaning Tower of Pisa,
Mm-hmm.
And as Christians, we should be more like a big fan.
Oh man, yeah.
Standing direct, square, and level, and not leaning.
Yeah.
So that's the way our faith needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
The example of that building one.
Amen. And again, too, even within that as well, for our church and our story right now, when our church started, we had someone who was transgender. They had gender identity questions. Our church I don't think has ever had more than 2 months where we haven't had someone fellowshipping with us who has come behind the scenes and said, I identify as same-sex attracted, right? I'm a boy who likes boys. I'm a girl who likes girls. And we allow them to come in and be a part of the family of Christ and all this different stuff and sit down and hear these things. However, they also know that anytime we hit these portions of text that speak against homosexuality, there's not going to be a softening of the truth. We're inviting them into the church, yet we're inviting them into truth, or we're not helping them at all. Meaning, like what you're saying there, we are not inviting the world in to influence us. We're inviting the world into the light so that they may see their need for Christ. Because like you said, Mary Grace, it's up and down. We don't lean to accommodate the culture. We recognize that the culture, whatever it may be, still needs Christ, and they're more than welcome among us. However, we have to please God. That's our only calling, right? If we don't do that, we've already failed. Anything else, guys? And again, that's going to be such an interesting thing for these next 4 years. There's going to be so many headlines, so many things said by our president that we're going to have to be like, yes, yes, and no. Bible does say that. That was terribly out of context. I don't know about that conclusion, but I will say this is God's picture of it. Or we'll have to sit back and go, look, the man said this. I'm not saying that he's charming. But biblically, that's moral, okay? I've got to be anti-abortion for a number of reasons biblically. We can't stand and say we're allies to these different lifestyles for a number of reasons biblically. Love the person, can't say we love the movement. We're going to have a lot of times where we have opportunities to go, we're not saying that we stand 100% behind this figurehead, but we are saying that we stand 100% between Christ. And when this figurehead gets it right, woo! However, also know on the flip side, when they get it wrong, biblically, we're also called to keep brothers to account. We're like, not that, though. Just take the Twitter away, but that was a good policy, and we're going to move through these things, and it's going to be super interesting. Let's read verses 36 and 37. Somebody want to read that for me?
Yes, I can.
Please.
And the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. Shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. For he shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the God, or no other desires of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them.
Beautiful. What version are you reading out of, brother?
New King James.
Very cool. Love it. This becomes an interesting point in the chapter. What it reads here is that he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. He will say unheard things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, right? But then it says that he will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors. Antiochus doesn't quite fit this. True, he thought himself a god, yes, with the presence of God on earth incarnate. He definitely had a high opinion of himself, yet he didn't bring a statue of himself into the temple of Jerusalem. He brought a statue of Zeus. That was the god of his forefathers. This doesn't fit the historical picture as well, which causes people to stop and go, I don't know if we're still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. We may be talking about the Antichrist now, because the Antichrist will likewise be in the temple, do some unimaginable things, but he's not going to erect a statue to another god. He's going to erect a statue to himself, right? Antiochus takes place in 167 BC, and yet later on, a time that hasn't come yet, someone else is going to match that step for step, but go a little bit further. In Revelation 13, verses 14 through 15, we see the image of the beast set up, and a choice is given to those who come to it to either worship or to die. They have to take a mark, 666, the mark of the beast, or they're not going to be able to buy and sell, and they're going to be put on a hit list, right? So when scholars read this, they go, we've changed a little bit of our focus now in the chapter. We've read about Antiochus, and now we're reading about something else. In Daniel chapter 11, verses 38 and 39, it says, instead of them, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver and precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. Some say these verses are pointing towards the Antichrist. And when it says that he worships or will honor a god of fortresses, this is not suggesting a deity that is dedicated, like the patron saint of walls or something like that. But instead, this is pointing him towards being a worshiper of force, that he believes in military force, and that's the thing that he pays his homage to. That fortresses aren't gods, but that certainly he can worship military might. And many Bible teachers believe the idea of honoring this God with gold and silver and precious gifts is that investment of the Antichrist into what will make his ability to dominate others possible through force. In verse 39, we can see the Antichrist seems to use this quote-unquote God of military might to destroy those who stand in his way, and he places those who support him in places of influence, just as Antiochus did in Egypt. And then we get the next few verses, and guys, these are really, really debated over, okay? So we're going to talk about this, and we're going to try to plug in both meanings here. And the question is this now focusing back on Antiochus in history, or is this focusing on the Antichrist in the future? Or is this both? So let's read it carefully. We're first going to apply it as if it is talking about the past. And then we'll make reference about what it might be talking about if it was the future. And then again, we're going to throw our hands up a little bit and go, could be both. There could be details that match on both sides here. So in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40a, it starts at the end, or at the time of the end. And this is where the debate starts. Which end? Are we talking about the end times? Some would point and say that's the end we're speaking of. Others would say, no, that's not the end we're speaking of, because in verse 35, it says there will be a purifying of the wise until they're made spotless, quote, until the time of the end. They think that this is the end of that oppression under the Greek Empire, that the Jews there who were being oppressed would have to suffer until Greece was no longer oppressing them, and when worship could be reinstilled in the Jerusalem temple. So they're saying that's the end that they're speaking of, and that's where our debate starts, right? If it is history that we're reading about, it fits very nicely, not over the time of Antiochus, but over the time of the end of the Greek Empire, which came immediately after him. Let's read ahead in verses 40 through 41. The end of verse 40 says, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. Now, this is worded a little bit confusingly in the historical side of things, but people say, okay, if this conflict is not speaking about the southern Greek kingdom and the northern Greek kingdom, if this is speaking indeed about the conclusion of the Greek Empire, then this is actually going to be about the Greek Empire of the south versus the empire located to the north of it, which would be Rome. So when we're talking about the king of the north, this is speaking about the Roman emperor. And the Roman Empire would conquer their enemy, Antiochus Epiphanes, and seize Israel, the land beautiful, as well as many other territories. And they would have a final conflict in the south. They would have a final conflict with the ruler of Egypt. At that point, it was a man named Mark Antony. How many of us know of him? He's a Roman. And Mark Antony was married to the final Ptolemaic descendant to sit on the empire or the throne of Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra, and it is that Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra the seventh. So what would take place is Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the south would oppose Rome and would lose to Rome. What would take place is that the Roman forces under the leadership of Marcus Agrippa during the time of the reign of Caesar Augustus, the same man who would be ruling during the life of Jesus, would come down and engage these southern forces, and they would engage them with 400 ships and 80,000 infantry soldiers. What would follow would be the Battle of Actium, and the defeat of the southern king Mark Antony and the removal of that last Greek ruler in the bloodline, Cleopatra. Then we read verses 42 and 43. It says, he will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. There it is, Egypt falls. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, which Rome would, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission. He would dominate the area. If this is indeed historical, Daniel just gave us a look at the end of the Greek Empire. Again, isn't that far off here? That's not a crazy thing to say. It fits quite well. But not only that, he would stretch ahead to give us the end of the Roman Empire as well in the closing verses, verse 44 and 45. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Rome in its twilight would separate. They would get separated into the west and into the east, one of those directions spoken of here. And they would start to fight each other. There would be a civil war until Rome really dissipated in much of its power. And then they would be invaded and attacked by groups from the north. These were the Gothic people, the Vandals, the Osgoths, and the Hun. These were Germanic people that they had tried to subjugate and couldn't. And they would raid and conquer and divide different parts of Rome until Rome basically ended up just completely dissolving. They were no longer able to keep their emperors in place. They did not have a government that could speak of. They just completely dissolved down. So Daniel could be giving us a look at the end of the Roman Empire as well. He plays out what would happen all the way from the Greeks not even being formed as that powerful nation yet, fighting the Persians, all the way through the Greek succession of power, all the way through the Greek-on-Greek conflicts, all the way until the Romans getting involved in this, all the way until the Romans dissolving. An incredible snapshot of history, a valid reading of the text. Others would argue this is not historical. We're not reading about history here, that this is a snapshot of prophetic times and of what is coming during the time of the Antichrist. They would say the Antichrist would destroy those who stand against him, but would suffer invasion from Jesus and will face off with him in Israel. We know this, right? In a place now called Tel Megiddo. That's the modern day name for it. It's the Valley of Megiddo. This is where the Battle of Armageddon will take place. And what will ensue is that the Antichrist armies will be destroyed by the armies of heaven, led by Jesus on a white horse. Revelation 19, right? And this is a pretty good explanation of that location, of where an army might set up if they're about to fight against another army in that valley. They would be between some holy mountains, and they would be right up against the coastline. Makes a lot of sense for that too. So, leaves us with this. Are they speaking about history? Possibly. It would make sense. Are they speaking about future? Possibly. Would make a lot of sense. Are they speaking about both? Possibly. Would make a lot of sense. We will know one day. I don't know today. Every different commentary and reasons I could find differed in some way in their opinion of one another. So let's just say this. Take from this what you can. I think the historical angle is infinitely fascinating, but I'm a nerd. The ending, though, is assured. There will come an end time when Jesus returns. There would come an end time to the oppression of Israel under the Greeks. If they endured, there would be a reward from God. We see the blessing of God continue in Israel as the Messiah shows up during the life of that emperor who would see the end of the Greek Empire, okay? If they held on through the Epiphany season, they'd be a short time removed from the Messiah coming into Jerusalem. Salvation was on its way. For those Christians that this is speaking about the Antichrist and they are watching this global sweeping away of the enemies of the Antichrist, hold on because Christ is coming once again and salvation is on its way. Amen? Thoughts? We're here, guys. We made it. If I was on time to start this, we would have hit it, boom, right on that hour mark. But any questions about this? Any thoughts about this? Anything that stuck out to you guys?
Well, as a kid, I always thought history was boring, but there's a lot of tea.
There's a lot going on. Yeah, there's some pettiness. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And sad.
Yeah.
How a leader can take the idol. There's so many people
Oh, yeah.
Or you know, it has an impact on so many.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, they can fall right in line sometimes. Or they try to resist, and there can be a harsh punishment there too. And that's well established in the history of Christianity. You know, we are not out of the time of martyrs. We are still paying a price for following Christ globally. So, and yeah, whether it be, you know, financial gain or a fortified religion or something else like that too. It doesn't have to be one thing. Anything else, guys? Did that all make sense? Did we do okay? That was a lot of stuff and a lot of ground to cover. I know, Darlene, if your head's spinning, mine too. Yeah, I wish. I wish. Yeah, you got to chew it over a little bit.
Kind of set in a little, yeah.
I was reading over this again and again. I finished it today where I was like, I started it like I was supposed to. Usually I'm done by now. I was just in there like, okay, just make sure you got that history right though, because there's a lot of kings named Antiochus, and there's a lot of Cleopatras, and there's a lot of, just make sure it's the right So there's a lot of reviewing the history to go over this stuff. And like I said, a lot of commentaries who were just like, well, I think this. Neat. Why? Meh. Well, I think this. Why? Well, because this kind of fits and this fits. Okay. But what about this other thing? No answer. Just chasing down all these lines to try to make sure we got the best glimpse we could out of this. So I apologize that it's not perfect. I'm not sure any pastor has the perfect interpretation of this. But I think that's, you know, hopefully a good college try for our church to say we have some knowledge of what's happening here. And again, too, I would offer this up, guys. If you want to know more about this stuff, one of my favorite resources that sometimes like my kids will watch and stuff like that, there's something called Oversimplified History. And it is like 20 minutes of history, and it just gives you a crash course and stuff having to do with like Romans or different things like that, where it's like, oh, okay, that helps just a little bit, you know? They're humorous. They're not supposed to be like a whole college class, but it helps you get some understanding of what's going on during the time. And it's really neat because, again, the Bible is historical. So if you understand some of what's going on during like the Persian, Greek, Roman times, well, you understand kind of the culture Jesus is living through, or you understand the oppression the Israelites are going through under Babylon and Assyria. You understand what's going on in their time with the Persians. You understand kind of what's going on in these conflicts, and Israel's caught in the middle and how they're suffering. Now we have the Maccabees, which is in that time of silence in the Bible right before the New Testament. It just helps add some of that texture and things like that. I think one of the nicest things anyone has ever said after preaching a sermon to me is, you make the Bible seem like it comes alive. I was like, well, it is alive, and it's part of real life. So if you study the rest of real life around the Bible, you understand the Bible a little more too, which is nice because it doesn't feel like some far-off holy book. It's like, oh yeah, so-and-so was alive when this was going on. Interesting, like other histories were taking place. The Roman Empire was running its course during this time, you know? So that's where we end up with Jesus being in Bethlehem, because the census is being called by Emperor Augustus. Emperor Augustus is in power, and he's taking more land and all this stuff during this Greek Empire time. And that's why he called the census. Is, okay, let's find out how many people we have. Let's properly tax them, because the Roman Empire was being kind of founded in a new way and with larger borders. And now it's interesting because you're like, wait a second. God allowed Antiochus to do what he did with the Greeks, but then he also knew that they would fall. He orchestrated the time of the fall so that this Roman emperor would call a census at the right time, because we never have biblically anywhere where Mary and Joseph are told to go to Bethlehem. We instead have them obeying a census. God works, not simply by telling them, just go over there, or them having a checklist of prophecy, like, okay, we got to do this, then this, to make sure our kid is legitimately the Messiah. God led them through the hand of the most powerful man, and maybe in Roman history as their emperor, and God does it so simply. This is his sovereignty. I'm just going to, bop, bop, bop. Okay, he's in Bethlehem. Perfect. We're just going to continue on with my plan. It falls together perfectly, and that helps us see the scale God works on. Super neat little detail that you don't recognize unless I'll read the history too, you know? All right. Anything else, guys, before we close in prayer? Good. I just find it super neat. So, all right, let's pray. Lord, we thank you, God, for how you move through history and the amazing scale you work on, God, and the fact that we have some peace, Lord, in what's going on around the Bible and during the time of the Bible. And then we even have history that's built upon the knowledge of the Bible, Lord. And it's so cool to see that our faith intertwines itself, Lord, realistically and impactfully, God, even with the secular world. That we're not on some distant cloud nine. We're not look within yourself and ignore things. We're not you have to chant a mantra in order to start to access truth, Lord. We can just look at an archaeological dig and be like, dang, he called it. It's so cool, Lord, that we have a verifiable faith. It is so cool that we have an impactful faith, Lord. And I pray, God, again, make us students of your word, Lord. Even if we don't know this crazy history or the drama that's going on, Lord, help us to understand when we read something and go, oh, that means, and be able to connect these dots together, Lord, because the timeline of the Bible, Lord, is so much further than one kingdom. It is so much more involved than just one ruler, Lord. And if we have an understanding of these things, God, for students of your word, Lord, not only will we have history to verify, God, not only will we have prophecy to look forward to, Lord, but we'll also be holding on to truths, God, that are applicable and make an impact in our lives. So help us to be well-rounded Christians. Help us not to pick and choose which parts of the Bibles we want to read and then leave the rest out there, God. Help us to be willing to dig deep and seek the truth in all of it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you're watching on live stream, guys, God bless you.